Audio presentation adapted from an article in American Socialist, February 1956. The Southern Negro Stirs by Conrad Lynn. By Conrad Lynn. About the author, a courageous attorney, who fought many important segregation and civil liberties cases. Conrad Lynn was co-counsel with Arthur Garfield Hayes in the only court test armed forces Jim Crow be carried to the United States Supreme Court. That involved the refusal of Winifred Lynn to submit to induction in a segregated Army unit during World War II. He later in 1947 to 1949 was counsel in the case of mixed Negro and white groups, to test the legality of segregation in Southern transportation. The campaign, in which Mr. Lynn participated directly, took place in 4 states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee and Kentucky, leading to a number of arrests and, in some cases, chain gang sentences. His later important public cases have had Puerto Rico as their setting. He defended pacifist Ruth Reynolds against a charge of collaboration with the Puerto Rican nationalist movement in alleged advocacy of the overthrow of the United States government. Mr. Lynn was also attorney in the case of the Puerto Rican nationalist leaders, who were prosecuted and imprisoned for sedition. Mr. Lynn also joined as counsel in the Braden Wade case in Kentucky. In 1956, the most inspiring area in the United States was the Old South. The rest of the country exclaimed in horror at the mutilation murder of Emmett Till and the sickening whitewash of its perpetrators. The cowardly Bellinzone shootings, the bullwhip and shotgun reigns of a Sheriff McCall in Florida, or a Byrd, or Strider of Mississippi, expose the hideous visage of race dictatorship for all the world to see. Who can blame other Americans for decrying the hanging out of such dirty linen? But they view the scene from only one angle of vision. While the masses of Negroes accepted an economically depressed, socially inferior status, it was seldom necessary for the ruling class openly to employ such brutal tactics. Lynching was the prerogative of the poor white and the petty shopkeeper. It served the function of keeping the Negro in his place, while the upper class remained carefully off stage. In the late 1950s, such aloofness could no longer be pretended. A social structure was being shaken, and the Southern aristocrat soon had his back against the wall. The so-called Southern way of life was constructed around the turn of the 20th century after the Negro had enjoyed a short-lived emancipation. The Southern pattern was less of a crazy quilt than the more hypocritical Northern accommodation. A tiny Negro business and professional class was permitted to exist but in a strictly segregated locale. It was reasoned, with some justification, that pressure from below could thus be siphoned off, and the educated Negro could be given a stake, as a minor partner of Jim Crow. But 2 world wars loosened the grip of the traditional ruling classes everywhere, and at last the semi-feudal rulers of the South were confronted with the handwriting on the wall. The cotton-picking machine chased the poor white from the fields as tenant farmer or overseer, and he later found employment in the Texas oil fields or in the many newer industries that found his labor cheaper than in the unionized North. He even painfully began to learn in the sugar refinery strikes in Louisiana, and in the longshore struggles of the Gulf ports, that he has a fundamental identity of interest with the despised blacks. The lesson was being learned slowly but inescapably. Is it any wonder, then, that the ruling class in the South openly assumed the helm in the savage struggle to smash the Negro back? The amalgamation of the white citizens' councils into the Federation for Constitutional Government found a score of ex-governors and ex-senators lined up with such active politicians as Talmadge, Eastland, Fielding Wright, Griffin and Strom Thurmond. Appropriately, a major industrialist, John U. Barr, was its chairman. One of its first acts was to put out feelers for alliance with Rumley and Mervyn K. Hart. Thus, as something akin to American fascism appeared on the scene. Numberless anonymous little Negroes, who trudged to the polls to vote, who dared to challenge Jim Crow on buses, who petitioned for non-segregated schools, compelled the polarization of forces. In most instances these actions were without the sanction of their major spokesman, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Winifred Lynn was denied support when he refused to submit to induction in a segregated army. Irene Morgan did not have official approval, for sitting in the white section of a bus in 1946. The National Office of the NAACP hesitated to endorse the fight of Andrew Wade and his white friends, the Bradens, for a home in an unsegregated neighborhood of Louisville. What was true of the national body, however, was not true of the branches of this organization. When the writer was jailed in Petersburg, Virginia, in 1947, for refusing to move to the colored section of a bus, the local branch of the NAACP was quick to come to his aid. Local Negro leaders of the battle for equality in the South almost uniformly came from indigenous chapters in the various states. McCoy and Howard of Mississippi, the youthful Carl Gray of Montgomery, Alabama, Simpkins of Columbia, South Carolina, Calhoun of Georgia, to mention only a few, were all active NAACP members. Until the late 1950s, the NAACP had been dominated by its northern constituents. The northern middle-class Negro had accepted a second-class status, which was for the most part not as galling as that suffered by his southern brother. At the same time, influential in his councils, were liberal whites like Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt and H.B. Lewis, whose hearts bled for the Negro but who were anxious that the Negro not be too ready to bleed for himself. Inevitably, the influence of this faction had to wane as the struggle in the South intensified. Why is it that among the most prosperous Negro in the South were found many of the most militant fighters for social emancipation? A glance at Morocco, the Gold Coast, or Indochina, affords a clue to the answer. In many respects, the situation of the Negro in the South was analogous to that of oppressed colonials. Regardless of his economic station, he was barred in many crucial areas from participation in the national life. From this circumstance, however, we need not adopt the Stalinized Communist Party's deduction of self-determination for the Black Belt as much as any non-accepted group. The Negro in America has sought integration into the general body politic. While the leadership of the current struggle had come from the educated middle-class Negro, as the fight deepened, the Moses rights among the downtrodden mass came to the fore. This was a sure sign that this campaign differed fundamentally from all that had preceded. Every previous upsurge of the Negro had resulted in compromise with his inferior status consolidated at a slightly higher level than that which existed before. In the late 1950s, his fight coincided with the stirring of that vast world of color in Asia and Africa, awakening from a millennium of apathy. The lowliest Negro veteran remembered his experiences in Asia and Europe. The impact of a changing economic organization roused obscure impulses for rude participation in society's benefits. The Negro in a man is their great proletarian. The white worker can dream of rising to middle-class status, but the Negro is a worker in uniform, so to speak, a uniform he cannot take off, his skin. When such a group, deliberately kept for generations at the bottom of the social structure, begins to stir and raise its head, the whole edifice feels the shock. From D. MacDonald's Politics, February 1944. In the South, the Negro knew that his battles had admitted a further compromise. The basis of the decision of the United States Supreme Court that segregation, per se, is discrimination, made this implicit. That decision was only a recognition of the world's struggle for men's allegiances. Any doubt that the final contest for integration had been joined could be resolved by a visit to a Southern Negro church, such as the one in Lake City, South Carolina, which was burned to the ground by the blind and desperate mob. In this cultural center of the Negro, one was likely to hear on any occasion the singing of "O Freedom," and "Before I'll be a slave I'll be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord, and be free." The conflict assumed innumerable forms. In Augusta, Georgia, the Negroes won the right to vote, and threw out of office a reactionary board of education wedded to segregation. In Montgomery, Alabama, a young Negro woman refused to heed an order of a bus driver, to give up her seat to a white woman. 3 policemen dragged her in chains to jail. 3 days later, Carl Gray led a boycott of 40,000 Negroes, who walked as much as 5 miles, to work rather than submit any longer to Jim Crow on buses. The Negro taxi drivers cut their fare for their brothers to 10 cents, and even some white employers, in grudging admiration, called for their Negro servants in their own cars. In Orangeburg, South Carolina, the White Citizens Council decreed the firing from jobs of Negroes, who signed a petition for an unsegregated school system. The Negroes, who were in the majority there, placed a selective boycott on the leaders of the council. Economic ruin stared these worthies in the face. The Godchaw refinery in Louisiana hired armed thugs to break up the strike of Negro and white workers. The Union quietly provided all its members with the weapons of self-defense. In Louisville, Kentucky, a white man, Braden, sold a home to a Negro friend, Andrew Wade, in an unsegregated neighborhood. Hoodlums stirred up by the real estate interests fired shots into the house. Friends of Wade, Negro and white, volunteered to move into his house with guns, to protect home and family. In the dead of night a bomb was thrown under the home, partially destroying it. Wade sent his wife and baby away and grimly stayed on with his rifle. In Milford, Delaware, young white toughs set out to beat up Negroes in the Black Ghetto. They were thrown back and punished so severely by the erstwhile lowly blacks, that the police had to rescue them. In Mississippi a bloody showdown impends as the whites and blacks swept the hardware stores bare of guns and ammunition, and the white banking authorities announced that they would no longer extend credit on the crops of the Negroes that spring. Nor did the Negroes stand alone in the area of the fight. Small groups of dedicated whites all over the South risked everything to stand by his side, foreshadowing the ultimate reawakening of the disadvantaged whites. The history of populism and of native socialism in this region is ample testimony to the revolutionary potential of the Southern masses. Don West in Dalton, Georgia, the Bradens in Louisville, Charlie Jones in Chapel Hill, Minter, Cox and editor Hazel Smith of Mississippi, took but up the cause of their forebears. Finally, the remainder of the country was profoundly affected by the course of this crucial struggle. For the first time, any obscure region in the South knows that the acts of the hooded mob in the dead of night may be exposed by a Murray Kempton, or a Desmond, or even an anonymous field hand in Mississippi, who wrote to a Chicago paper of the terror in his neighborhood. Unquestionably the Negro was to experience attacks of mounting intensity, as fascist Jim Crow played its last cards. But who can doubt the eventual outcome?